Hello, everyone. Oh, my goodness, end of the day after lunch, and I am so excited to be the moderator of this panel, and let's give another shout out to my good buddy, Jeannie Allen, for all that she's done for kids and her team. Thank you so much, Jeannie. And because he's longer in the tooth, anytime I see him in the audience, I give a shout out to Howard Fuller in the back of the room, protecting the door. Give Howard, our leader. You see this panel here? I mean, this is like a Mount Rushmore of education reform. Yeah.
Not much.
By the way,
I don't know
Jeannie.
about that.
Yeah. By the way, Jeannie, you got a few silver foxes up here as well. I might add, now that I'm a grumpy old man. So I'm going to start at the far end and introduce folks, and then I'm going to spend some time talking with Frank in his new role and particularly what he's doing for the country. Tommy Thompson is a legend. Everyone knows his work as a former governor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
But from our vantage point, more significantly, his work in driving policy that worked for children is more than legendary. It is the essence of what is important for America's future. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. My honor.
Yes. I'm going to talk about Frank in a minute. My hero, my leader, Rod Page, the former U.S. Secretary of Education. People know what he's done for America. He's been a great friend. Whenever I make major decisions, I call him, and he blesses them, or he does not. But either way, he's a great friend. And then my brother-in-arms, Gerard Robinson, who is former Secretary of Education, led education policy in both Florida and Virginia, and now he's doing great work with Thurgood Marshall on behalf of historically black colleges and universities. Gerard Robinson, give him a hand. So, I want you to know this is not about me, so I'm going to stop doing all the talking. I do want to introduce Frank Brogan, who many of you know. He was former Secretary of Education here in this state, Lieutenant Governor. He's been a college university president. He's been Secretary or Chancellor of Education in Pennsylvania. And now he's running education policy for the United States at the Department of Education. Frank, it's an honor to have you with us, and I wanted to spend a few minutes before I introduce and bring other folks into the discussion. Just talk to us a little bit about how things are going. What do you see as some of the greatest challenges you're facing in terms of, as this program was teed up, shaping national education policy? Tell us what you're thinking about that.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, and the real reason I'm here is when I saw who else was on this panel, I knew if I didn't show up, they'd just spend the whole time talking nasty about me.
And he's looking at me, right?
So I decided I better be here just to cover myself to be here. I mean, Governor Thompson, I put in the same category with Governor Bush. Everybody who runs for governor says, vote for me, I'll be your education governor. I can put on one hand the number of people who actually were, and Tommy Thompson is one of those. He not only was a huge advocate for education reform change, he actually knew what he was talking about when it came to what kinds of changes and how it should look, and that's a very different portrait. I have on my shelf, Mr. Secretary, a picture of you and I in my office in the education building, and it is inscribed in the most wonderful way. It just says, to Frank, I am glad to be your friend, and it's from Rod Page, and I've had immense respect for this guy forever.
I got to interrupt you. You and I were together, too, at 9/11.
Yes, we were. We were actually in the classroom when Governor Bush was, if you all recall, the first graders were reading to him in a classroom, and Secretary Page was then the Secretary of Education, and I was there as the Lieutenant Governor, and as my governor called me, the education guy, so I went down to be a part of that, and it turned into a rather remarkable day, did it not, Mr. Secretary? Yeah, it was truly remarkable. Gerard, it's always great to see you, brother. I am awed by this panel without me. So glad to be here. Back to the question, Kevin. I was standing there in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as the chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, minding my own business last summer, and my phone rang, and it was one of those cell phone things that come up unknown. I couldn't help myself. I answered it and said, "Hi, this is Frank." And the voice on the other end said, "Hi, Frank, it's Betsy DeVos." And I have known Secretary DeVos from previous lives, and knew obviously she was the Secretary of Education, and was anxious to hear what she had to say to me. And long story short as I can make it, she asked me if I would come over to DC and visit with her, which I did. And we had a great conversation about what she envisioned for the Department of Education and education in general at all levels, and what I had done in my years, now 40 years of public service, and left off my best job. I started as a 5th grade teacher. That was and continues to be the best job I ever had. It was a middle school principal and superintendent of schools. I've been blessed at every stage of my career and life. But I ultimately, she asked me if I would consider joining the team. Now, based on the resume you just heard, the question that was on my mind was to do what? She finally decided, when I asked her to do what, she said, "Let me think about it, because I need a lot of things, and you might be able to do some of those." She was wrong, of course, but nevertheless, it's the only time she's gotten it wrong so far. But ultimately came back and asked, would I be the Assistant Secretary of Elementary and Secondary Education. I don't think she knew what kind of a reaction that was going to get, because I had just come out of literally 15 years in higher education, and I was thrilled. I cut my teeth on elementary and secondary education. It's where I started. My heart has never left elementary and secondary education, and I not only accepted, that's small potatoes. I was and continue to be enormously honored to be a very small part of what's going on in Washington. What is going on in Washington, Kev? Ironically, you don't hear the word bipartisanship much in Washington, D.C. these days, yeah? But one of the few areas that not only they will tell you in Congress was created in bipartisan fashion, but will tell you with a vengeance needs to maintain that bipartisan approach, is when we moved to the Every Student Succeeds Act. It really was a very bipartisan piece of legislation and created certain statutory requirements. But the people who were there when it was passed, and those that still are really passionate about the fact that it needs to remain that way. Now, truth be known, upon implementation, with the development of the Every Student Succeed plans for each of the states, Tommy, that have now all been approved, and now we're into the next phases of monitoring, review, best practice, evidence-based research on what we learn, all those things. There will be disagreements about implementation, but the essence was to do two things. One, start to move back toward more local control to states, SEAs, and locals, LEAs, and give them greater authority in how they set up their classrooms and their schools and their districts and their states as it relates to all things education. But the other piece, which is joined at the hip, because the two aren't mutually exclusive, was to also make sure that embedded within this process was a strong system of accountability to determine how children were faring as a result of all of this newfound local control and local authority, etc. And that is not only what is the buzz up there right now in education, at least, but it is also going to be the most fascinating part of this to watch. When the little dog chased the red sports car and then ultimately caught it, and master said, now that you've caught it, what are you going to do with it? It is a little like this. Now that we are giving back flexibility and opportunity, are people going to use it?
Yeah, let me ask you something real quick, Frank. So, first of all, I appreciate that the last reauthorization that you referred to was bipartisan, but a lot has happened since then. I want to talk about the elephant in the room in a minute, about how partisan things really are.
Yeah.
But what is the role of the federal government during this process of ceding back more authority to the local jurisdictions and states? I mean, what is the role? Many people feel like that there's a toothless tiger now, and I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, I mentioned phase 1 is complete, and that was the approval of all 52 plans, right? Phase 2 is the development of what we call the report card, the accountability strand. Some of it's laid out clearly in the statute which gave us the Every Student Succeed Act. Some of it is not, but that's what we're working on now, and we're working on it with the states who created these plans. And to make sure that not only do they have this greater flexibility, but can evidence the fact that this flexibility is providing things better for young people around the country. And so that is what's going on right now. And it does get interesting because now what this person thinks we should count is different than what that person thinks we should count. This one who thinks this metric is important thinks we shouldn't even bother with that, we ought to use that. And that's where you're going to start to see some of the differentiation on how to build the mousetrap. Before we even get to the waiver process, where people do through this thing have the ability to request waivers of the department to do things differently. And then I'll end here. This is where the rubber meets the road. To me, there's always been a difference between change and innovation. People use those two terms interchangeably. I do not. Change is just doing something different than you used to do it. Innovation is trying to create substantial and ongoing and long-term successful change. That's different. And if you look at the private sector and see the innovations that have changed the world, it wasn't just let's do something different.
Yeah.
It was a methodology and a culture and a true change that took place as a result of that.
I was going to ask you about innovation, Frank, because you know, with the changes that are taking place and with the politics and the partisanship, is there room for innovation with all this going on in the rancor? Are we able to come together around innovation in education?
I think we are. I think, and that's
And if
hard
so,
to say.
what's the road?
That's
How do
hard
we
to
get
say
there?
in the middle of all the upheaval
Yeah.
where, you know, I even listened to it in the conversations today. Isn't it interesting how a word can mean 10 different things to 10 different people? They hear 10 different things. And if you use that word because it means this to you, somebody else will challenge you. That's not what that word means. No, it's just, that's not what that word means to you, but it's what it means to me. Yeah. And I say that because I think the Department of Education has an opportunity to capture that bipartisan spirit that went into the creation of this law and now work with the states and the territories to try to create the things that have to happen to ultimately give way to the real innovations that are going to change. That conversation just took place at this table right here was marvelous because you weren't just talking to people trying to sell you the latest computer system. That's how technology started in education, right? You were at on the bad end of that conversation about, I'm here to sell you my technology. Now people, when they talk about technology, are actually talking about philosophy, mission, and innovation versus just changing to things. And we've got to capture that moment, Kevin, even in spite of all the rancor and all of the incredible divisiveness that we're seeing in Washington.
And I appreciate your spirit behind that. I want to bring everyone else in. So, Governor, when you think about the reality of what's going on, and the states are going to be getting more and more authority, and we're going to focus on accountability, you know, you lived a lot of that. How do you think things are going in terms of the states not only receiving this kind of power and authority and accountability, but making sure it benefits kids? And let me just say this, as opposed to sort of the three-card Monte game of shifting things around and making it look a certain way when many, many kids still aren't getting what they deserve.
I don't see much difference. I think the world of this man. He's a leader, but I really don't think that educational quality has improved that much. And I'm sad about that. And I don't see any governors out there like the John Englers and the Mike Levitts and the Tommy Thompsons that are willing to innovate and try something new. I see the status quo. I see the teachers union still pretty much controlling everything. School boards are afraid to act. It's great to have the local control, and it's great to do it, but if the superintendents, the local level, the school boards, and the teachers are still controlled by the teachers union and are so afraid to make any changes, I don't see us improving the quality of education like I want to see. And I just don't see anybody else out there at the local level pushing it. Several people in this panel are, and I compliment them, and Jeannie Allen is certainly the queen as far as educational reform, along with Wade Dyke, and I marvel at them, and my friend Howard Fuller, haven't had a chance to see him yet, are there. But I personally, and I may be wrong, and I'm sure I'm going to start an argument, but I personally do not see the kind.
That's why I called on you first.
I personally do not see the kinds of innovation, the quality, and the accountability that all of us in this room have been arguing for a long time. I see more status quo and more finger pointing, more polarization, and nobody really wanted to take the leadership role, and that is sad.
Yeah. Dr. Page, you want to weigh in on this?
I guess so. One of the concerns that I have is that we don't have a national urge to do better in education. And I think that's going to be a problem for us compared to our European and Asian neighbors, because many of the issues are founded based on the quality of education, which is promoting advancement nationally. Secretary Duncan used a term some time ago. He said education was in stagnation. I thought about that. We're talking about stagnation, not moving, not progressing, staying in one place. So I took a look at the NAEP data and the OECD data to see if there was any basis for that. And what I found out was that there's solid evidence for that. You look at the long-term data in NAEP, and you can not help but walk away and say, we are in a state of stagnation as far as education is concerned. For example, the age 17 kids in NAEP, in 1971, the average score was 285 in reading. In 2012, it was 287 in reading. That's a 2-point gain in 41 years. 4 1/100ths of a point per year gain. That's pretty close to stagnation in my view. So I asked the question, what is it? Why is this happening? Because I think we've gotten stagnated in our approach to it, how we approve education as well. For example, and this is just a personal view, I think there are 4 different strategies that we can kind of use to improve education. 1, increase the quality of the instruction, make it better. All the strategies to do that. 2, the quantity of it, like Kip says, more of it. 3 would be the resources for it, provide more resources for it, which we know who argues about that a lot. But there's a 4th one, in my view, that we have not put much emphasis in, which may be one of the most important ones out there, and that is, how do we increase the psychological and physical energy that students themselves put into learning? Learning requires work. You look at all the helping professions. The provider is in no other health profession held responsible for the product like it is in teaching. If the students don't progress, it's the teacher's fault. Very little emphasis looking at whether or not the student has put in effort there. For example, if a provider was teaching a person to lose weight, it's good to the provider be a real good teacher to teach lose weight, But if the person who's a student doesn't control their diet, no matter how good this teacher's going to be, that it ain't happening. And so the question comes to my mind is, what are some of the things that we can do? This is especially the lower part of the learning scale. What can we do to mediate that? And I think that we've got to spend some time and some thought asking, how do we convince the students, how do we make them understand that the work that they have to put into in order to learn is of value to them and that they will benefit from that? I think that's probably a new approach that's not happening much. A little of it is happening in KIPP and some places like that, but I think more of it needs to happen.
So one thing that you touched on, and I'm going to bring Gerard in here, is this sense of urgency. I like to talk about it being cultural, and when you talk about a sense of urgency, some school communities have it, some neighborhoods have it, many families have it, but how do you create a national sense of urgency around all children getting what they deserve? I mean, and a sense of urgency where it's not I like to say the 5 or 10 year plan, but Gerard, you've been an education leader in a couple of states and you've done this work all over the country. Tell me your thoughts on that.
When Jeannie founded CER, I was leaving being a 5th grade teacher in Los Angeles and got involved in public policy in California. When I think of sense of urgency, I go back to Nation at Risk. There was at least a national narrative that if we were attacked by another country, this would be an issue. We don't have that national narrative, but I don't see that as a problem. The reason I remain optimistic is because I see the urgency at the local level. And the learning culture that's created at the local level is driven by 2 factors. Number one, a lot of moms, many of them who are single, who are saying, I want something radically different for my child and I will do what it takes to make it happen. So when the moms are involved, trust me, things get done. Number 2, the most unlikely place to look for education reform, hunger, and urgency are people who are in prison and those who've come out of the juvenile justice system. And how they wake up and say, you know what, I want to do something radically different. And so I've said probably for the last 3 years, the innovation for what we're going to need for working adults, we should start looking to what's taking place inside incarceration facilities. And we can argue smart on crime, tough on crime. That's not the point. The point is you've got a captivated audience who for no other reason decided I'm going to now take an education. And I recently had an event at CAO where I had someone who's doing a PhD at NYU now after spending 20 years in prison going in with no high school diploma. And so I look to other alternative ways of understanding schooling and learning. That's where the optimism is, but I don't per se expect to see a national voice on that one right now.
Tom?
Can I?
Yes.
I want to weigh in on 2 things here. First off, I mentioned lack of leadership. And I really think we have a lack of leadership at the local level and the state level. I think governors have got to do it. And if you remember back when President Bush first and President Clinton called all the governors together, what happened? We had the national attention of everybody on what was happening in education.
That's right.
We need to get back to having leadership, and President Trump should call all the governors in, and maybe it would ignite some excitement about that. In regards to prison, I've been involved in welfare reform. I led on choice, I led on things, and I led on HIV in Africa when I was Secretary of Health. So I've been a leader in big things. My big thing, and I'm glad you brought it up, is prison reform. We have an opportunity to really change education for the better in the prison system. I want to have changed in Wisconsin, and I'm putting together a coalition to change prisons into education establishments. I want to have prisons to be turned into schools. I want to have all the prisoners analyzed as far as to their abilities and so on and so forth. Some can't get out, but I think 1/3 is going to get out and are very qualified. They just haven't had the opportunity. 1/3 can be worked in. But I want to set up with the vocational schools, with the University of Wisconsin, a whole institution. I want to turn a prison into a school this coming year in Wisconsin. And I want to make sure that those prisoners get the best education. I've already got bought in from the private university system, Madison, and the vocational school. And then the prisoners have got to apply. They got to be assessed, they got to apply, and if they screw up, they go back in and don't get it. But they have a chance to work themselves out of prison. And I got businesses that are going to sponsor them. So it's going to be, they're going to go to school in the morning in prison, they're going to go into the workforce in the afternoon as an intern and an apprenticeship, and then they go back to prison in the night and study. And if they complete their drug and alcohol assessment, their school assessment, they're going to be able to get a get out of jail free card and go to work for that company. And you're going to find, I think, individuals that have never had an opportunity to really say education is the way, and it might be the example that we need to kickstart education. If you turn around the prisons and start doing it, and young men and women in prison say, I got my education and I got a good paying job, you're going to break, reincarnation, and their recidivism is going to be broken, and young men and women are going to have a chance. And I really think it's going to help kickstart. And if we get the president to start it, if we get started in the prison, I really think we've got some good ideas.
I know Rod wants to come in. I will say I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that our prison population has been ignored and marginalized in terms of the potential of many of the inmates, but also focus on the current school-to-prison pipeline, where a lot of, we can limit the number of people who go to prison if we educate those babies early on. And I really feel like that having a greater sense of urgency for children at a young age is really something that we've got to figure out. And I think leadership is important. It's something we really need to have some focus and attention placed on, because you're right, it's not what it used to be. But Rod, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just want to second Tommy's idea about the national summit that happened in Charlottesville in '89. It was the second one that happened in Palisades with Clinton and Bush again. And that was a jump after that. But it's been much more difficult now. For example, in '08, the Gates Foundation and the Broad Foundation had a budget for $60 million in order to jumpstart that idea in the United States of America, and it kind of fell apart. It didn't work, so we got to find a different way of doing it.
So let me bring in higher ed in the discussion. Frank, you and Gerard both have had deep experience in higher ed, and I want Gerard in a minute to talk about that, as well as the role of the HBCUs. But, when Governor Bush was talking about what's going on in higher ed and some of the challenges, you know that intimately. And many of us have always felt that leaders in higher ed, many of them have sort of discharged their responsibilities, just have not worked with local school districts. I tell you, I was on a plane with someone who is a chancellor of a major state university a few years back. We happened to be sitting next to each other, and he recognized me, and he said, "Oh, I appreciate your work." He said, "Well, you need to keep doing what you're doing." He talked about that, 90% of our graduate students in STEM areas are foreign-born. And, he said people talk about the shortage of folks of color and women in STEM graduate programs. He said, "I don't even have a large number of white males in my STEM programs." He said, so the education reform push is vitally important. And I asked him, I said, well, because I knew which state he was from. I said, well, why don't you do more? Because in your K-12 system, there's some real challenges. Maybe if you stepped up and you had some of your peers work, you could help push some of these school districts. He said, oh, well, no, I've got my board of trustees. And he started to back away when I actually was challenging him on what he could do publicly to really push for better outcomes. So where does the higher ed's gone through its own reformation? What's that relationship, and what could it be in terms of driving some of the sense of urgency in schools?
And I won't go back and regurgitate all the great things that Governor Bush said about higher education. Everybody was there, but just say he is spot One of the things that we are doing in the department right now, and when I say this word, don't glaze over yet, give me a minute, right? We've taken the lid off of the accreditation process. Now, why am I going to hit that for a minute? Because what people don't understand oftentimes is what holds us in irons, whether it's K-12 or whether it's higher ed, are the traditions, the process, the policies, the procedures, and the politics that won't let it change, and will fight fiercely to protect it, all under the umbrella of the wonders that are created by those traditions and the processes that we've created. Accreditation is one of those things. Accreditation is based largely on peer review. I'll show you yours if you show me mine, right? And at the end of the process, since I'm probably going to be on the team that looks at yours, yours is looking pretty good. I just want you to know that. It's not that peer review of anything is a bad thing, but when it becomes the sum and substance of how we determine whether things are done right, you are literally taking on the fox in the henhouse approach to this thing. Nobody wants to tell anybody that they're doing anything wrong, because they're going to be the same people that you want to tell you what you're doing so well. By virtue of that fact, we have regional accreditation entities. We have private accreditation entities out there. The ones getting their brains beat in right now are the private accreditation entities, because God forbid that we allow private higher education to flourish. Because just like K through 12, that's a horrible idea. Charter schools, school choice, we've got to use the government-run schools. It's the only way to do business. It's the best thing for boys and girls. It's no different in higher education, everybody. It's held in check with a system of accreditation that tells everybody exactly how to walk, talk, and chew gum. And you're not allowed to innovate. First of all, because they wouldn't know innovation if it walked up and grabbed them by the behind. And second, because innovation means real change. And we don't want to change something that was created in medieval times and hasn't changed a great deal since then, right? Why do you think we still wear regalia at graduation? The idea of change. Somebody like a Mitch Daniels, by the way, what has he got? He didn't come from higher education. So he didn't worry about asking how to challenge the basic assumptions. He grabbed hold of that thing and shook a wonderful but very traditional university and shook it by the lapels and got them to see maybe we can do it differently. We've heard the name Crow mentioned. ASU is doing remarkably different things, but they are the exceptions, not the rule. And the traditions and the policies, the practices, procedures, the professional associations, doesn't matter again, K-12, doesn't matter if it's higher ed, are the things that are holding us back from allowing people and encouraging people. And until you change those, it won't be allowed to change. And so we're shaking that accreditation process and asking basic questions. Why do there have to be regional accreditors? Why don't we open the system up and let people go wherever they want for the accreditation process? Let them decide. Let people who major in innovation create a covey of their own and support it with people who know what innovation looks like and how it should be acknowledged and how it should be permissible, and not tell people, sorry, you can't do that. It doesn't work under the rubric we use today. I don't like the word accreditation either, because people go, oh God, there's an interesting topic. But it's an example of so many of the things that are holding all of our education systems in place. And it is supported by people who folks just don't want it to change. I'll shut up here. How can you allow a school of 1,000 children to exist where by any measure of accountability, you know 2/3 of them cannot read or write or calculate mathematically on grade level, but offer nothing by way of change and refuse to allow the parents whose children go to that school to choose anything different. And thank God every night they can't afford to do it on their own, so they don't have a choice. How is that even morally acceptable, much less acceptable to education, which we all tout as the most important thing in a child's life beyond family and faith and here, country, education. And yet we tell you where, when, what time, and how it's going to be done. That's great where it works, but where it doesn't, protect it from any change that might provide something better for boys and girls. I'll get off my soapbox there, but that's just a fact.
That was great.
Gerard,
You got me. I blame you.
what are your
You got me
thoughts
all
on higher ed?
No, no, but,
All we got to say now is amen.
and pass the hat. In 2010, when I worked for Governor Bob McDonnell in Virginia, one of the first pieces of legislation he signed into law was the College Laboratory Bill. And what we realized were two things. If you want to get students interested in different types of engineering, you can't wait until they walk into a college campus. And many of them, for a host of reasons, don't have the coursework to go into the type of high school they need to become competitive. So we said, let's create an incentive where universities will adopt a school and work there. So what happened? University of Virginia, in fact, we signed the bill at the Curry School of Education, the University of Virginia School of Education, the University of Virginia School of Engineering, the local community college came together, worked with the local school system, Charlottesville Public School System, adopted Buford Middle School. Buford Middle School, since the 1960s, had been a place where you send your kids, but when it was time to move, you sent your kids to private school afterward. It was a Title I school, mostly African-American, relatively small school system. With that happening, National Science Foundation put in $2.2 million. Companies began to wrap their hands around it. For the first time since the 60s, you saw an uptick in the number of families enrolling their students in what used to be a Title I school. You're bringing in the middle class, black and white, who are coming in saying, wait a minute, this is something radically different. China was mentioned a couple of times. One of the Chinese universities sent one of their professors there for a 2-year study to figure out what happened. Local people, governors, deciding let's create an incentive and putting a little side pot of money on the side to say, let's think about how we can do that. That's something practical and radically changing how families think about where they want to send their kids. The second thing is, and in fact, you mentioned Arnie Duncan, he went to the University of Chicago Laboratory School, first one in the country founded by John Dewey. In terms of what we're seeing with historically black colleges and universities, there are a lot of great innovative things going on, particularly taking first-generation college students and doing something radically different. But here's one problem we're not going to solve with higher ed if we don't address it: remediation at the college level. When I was in Florida, I put together a commission. I identified that we spend $185 million annually on remediation courses for students we gave a high school diploma to because they were college and career ready. They passed all the right metrics, they had all the right exams, and they were going to our Florida colleges. Frank knows this. Something's not adding up because they're now spending time in remediation, which aren't college-bearing courses, and they're spending 1, 2, 3 additional years in college, and you're broke already. So I think we need to do a better job of involving 2-year colleges and technical colleges in this conversation as well.
So, Secretary Page, you were just at your alma mater, Jackson State, from an interim basis, helped pick their most recent president. What are your thoughts on how higher...
Let's correct that. I did not help.
No,
I was trying to keep the place floating while they picked the president.
But so tell me, what are your thoughts on the role of higher ed?
This may be a little strange, but there's a linkage between many of the problems that are occurring in higher ed and in public ed. That has to do with the governance structure that guides the institutions. We found out this is really one of the major problems that's happening now in K-12 education. The governance structure in such a way that guiding the way the school operates is really pointed in the wrong direction. And I begin to see that at Jackson State, looking at other universities too, not just Jackson State, but all of the universities that I looked at need to find ways to improve the governance structure of those institutions.
You know what's interesting? You mentioned Mitch Daniels. I don't know if people know some of the things he's done, but real quickly, we talked at length about it. When he got to Purdue, he realized that there was a small number of African American and Hispanic students who were eligible in the state to even apply to attend Purdue, which is a highly academic STEM type school. And so it was his vision that he couldn't wait for the school system in the state to improve in some of these failing school districts. So he embraced his own form of innovation where he went out and created charter schools focusing on STEM, and he started in Indianapolis. He wants to do it in several other places around the state, and with the guarantee that these students who graduate will be able to go to Purdue. So in effect, he's creating his own pipeline for students he would need down the road.
That's true.
And the last question I'll ask on this issue of higher ed for anyone who has any thoughts on it, and I think it may come back to what Tommy Thompson was saying about leadership. How can we, develop the right type of willingness in the higher ed community to partner in the way that you talked about, that Ms. Daniels is doing, to ensure better outcomes for kids and make them more eligible for higher ed down the road? You got any thoughts, Frank?
The interesting thing, I just came from a state that has several higher education systems, and I was the chancellor of one of them, 14 universities in Pennsylvania. And trying to begin to make those kinds of changes and recognize that where you are is not good enough anymore, because if it were, 100% of your students would be graduating and doing it in 4 years. Silly to make a point, right? But at least a stretch that if only 48% of your students are graduating in 4 years, or 6 years, because we use the federal number 6.
Yeah.
And that many of your students never see a graduation stage, and many of those go home and default on their student loans and can't pay them off because their credit rating is fouled for the rest of their life. That just in that sense, when you say, we'll admit you, that's easy. I had a couple of those universities that admitted 99% of the students that applied. Letting them in is easy. What do you do with them when they get there, and more importantly, when they walk off the graduation stage in a timely fashion for a reasonable amount of money? What are they able to do and where are they able to go? And that's different than the old, well, what's your destination? I'm going to college. Well, that's not a destination. That's a stop on the way to somewhere else. Why are you going to college, and what do you want to do after college? And that all has to change. It's not good enough just to say, I want to go to college. And let me say this, bet you all have done it. We all have. And I've been with people who've done it. Take a group into a classroom of 5th graders, and the first question that the visitor asks is, hey, how many of you are going to college?
Yeah, it's always that.
And 100% of the hands go in the air while they look around at each other and go, I don't know why he raised his, but if he raised his, I'm raising mine, right? What's the problem with that? We also have got to change that mentality. I know what college did for me, first gen. I was a first generation student. I wanted to be a teacher. I know that to do that, I had to go to college. But I knew a lot of my classmates who never survived to see a graduation stage. They don't know why they went to college. They were just told you're supposed to. They weren't prepared for it academically. They weren't prepared for it in terms of the discipline that it takes to fight to get that degree in the time you've got. And I'm saying that to put down a marker. I love higher education. But folks, I was there 40 years ago as a middle school principal when we still offered pre-vocational coursework to students and required it of all of them before they graduated from 8th grade. Then they went on to high school and got even more refined coursework so they could start to identify where they really did want to go. We wanted them all to learn and walk off the high school graduation stage with the same skill sets, but decide then, did they want to go to a 4-year university? Did they want to go to a community college continue? Did they want to go to advanced vocational technical education? Or go right to the world of work and have the skills necessary to succeed when they got there? You know what happened? We started to treat that part of the ledger like the dumping ground.
Yeah.
That's where we started to put the kids who were most disruptive, put them in the vo-tech stuff. That's where we started to put kids who just couldn't handle the academic put them in the vo-tech stuff. And by the time we saw what we had done, we did what government does best. Instead of saying, man, we have just screwed up a great thing, let's go back and fix it because it's still the right thing to do, we did what government does. We just got rid of it. And now, thank God, we're talking about putting it back. We're talking about rebuilding the pathway opportunities for children to learn in elementary and middle and high school, to be exposed and learn about what's out there. Not necessarily have to make a decision yet, but at least know that the work they're doing is relevant to what they're learning and where they're going to go for the rest of their life. We're beginning to put a greater emphasis. We just reauthorize the career and vocational technical language in the Perkins Act to go back and begin to reinstate. And so when people talk about this is great and it's new, I'm too old, I know better. It isn't new. We're going back to the future.
Yeah.
But it's about time we did, so that every young person, when they walk off that high school graduation stage, won't have to stand there with a high school diploma saying, what do I do now? But they'll have an idea of what they want to do and more the skills to get them there.
And I think this has been just a wonderful discussion. But I still get back to the fact that you need leaders out there. We have got to get leaders. We got to recognize the leadership. You got Mitch Daniels, fantastic leader, not from higher education, but he came in to change it. We got to get him out. We got to get you four guys out speaking. And as far as apprenticeship, we got to start talking about apprenticeship. We got to start talking about sponsoring by business. Business has got to come in here and has got to start sponsoring students. We got to start educating parents that, being a plumber, you make more money than you do as a lawyer. And you have a better lifestyle than being a lawyer. And how many PhDs in history are tending bar across America today or driving cab? We have got to tell the story, that apprenticeship and internships and all of these things in vocational school is really a way to make a decent living. And that's what I want to start with my prison initiative. I want to bring in all kinds, I want higher education, vocational education, and business coming in and changing the prison system in America by educating them, as an example. But I think we got to do it in communities all across the country. And I think it comes back to leadership. If we don't have leaders, because right now social media, if you try and step out of that box, you're going to get clobbered by social media. The teachers union, everybody else is going to come down hard on you. So nobody wants to do it. Everybody says you got to go to the university or get your college degree. And if you step out of that box, you get criticized. You don't think my child's good enough. That's a bunch of bull. I want your child to succeed, and he or she can succeed as a welder or a plumber or a TV repair person or whatever, much better than being a lawyer. We got too damn many lawyers, and I'm a lawyer.
Kevin,
and so we need.
As I squirm uncomfortably.
So I think this. I wish this panel, somehow could be exported into every state and every assembly district in the country.
Gerard has some thoughts on this.
So there's two things I think we can do for leadership in higher ed. And number one, with this new set of governors likely to come into the fold and find themselves inaugurated in January, one thing all of you should think about is putting your name on a list for consideration for appointment as a university trustee, either at a university in your area or if it's a system, an appointment to that board. It's going to be tough to simply work with presidents because they have boards. And that's important. So I would say one thing you can do as leaders is to do that. Number two, as a graduate of your school, you should get together with a number of other alumni and put together enough money and start endowing chairs in the subjects you think are important. Because when you endow a chair and a professor's in that seat, he or she may be there longer than the president, longer than the board members, but you get someone in there who's going to have the right kind of mission, idea, and tenacity to get it done. So those are my two things for higher ed.
Gerard, can I just add to that? I want you to also tell everybody to run for the local school board.
That's what I was going to say. That's exactly what I was going to say.
I would love to have some of these people on the local school board.
That is, here's the thing. Unless the governance structure in K-12 is changed,
Yeah.
nothing else is going to matter.
That's right.
It will unravel everything else you try to do. There are no strategies that can overcome bad governance in K-12 education.
So let me piggyback on the vocational or career pathways piece and link that to something that Rod alluded to, that fourth tier, I think you said, where kids need to be motivated. What we have found is that by failing to offer kids opportunities with various career pathways, that we have almost negated and cut out opportunities for kids to be excited about learning. And I do think that there's, this idea of how to motivate kids. We know it's not in the traditional educational structure and the stand and deliver, where kids have to sit still, don't squirm, and sit there for 50 minutes and then listen to what I have to say and then regurgitate it back in 2 weeks and forget it 3 weeks after that. That doesn't work for today's kids who are adept at, PDAs and the like. But the one thing about the career pathways, particularly these kids who understand technology, is it's a way to make education and learning cool and fun. And I think that cool, fun factor, it matters for today's kids. I mean, Rod, I know a lot of kids don't want to work hard in the traditional setting, but I know my 18-year-old spent 10 hours breaking the code of the video game. And he mastered that. And he was on that game day in and day out a couple years ago. And if there was a way to translate that,
Yes, right.
I mean, and he was proud of the fact. We have found in our experience in teaching in the virtual context that it's amazing how many of our kids who are in our online programs hunger for those badges and coins when they get to the next level. Where's my coin? I've talked to teachers who have shown me, messages from students. You're going to give me my badge, right? I earned it. You saw that because the teacher didn't give it right away. So I do think that part of the dynamism associated with the future is making sure that we look at career education, vocational education, and you're right, Frank. It can't just be viewed as an aside or for the kids who are who've been challenged in the other system. It is something that can help jumpstart excitement in learning, which is sorely needed. But I know you want to say something.
I will, and I'll make this really fast, I promise. If I were king for a day, so that ain't gonna happen, don't worry about that, but if I were, and I could do just one thing in both K through 12 education and in higher education, I would require that every high school student before they graduate have an apprenticeship. Everyone. I don't care what they're going to do afterwards. Everyone before they graduate should have to put in practice what people have been teaching them along the way before they graduate and go out there and figure out what the next step is going to be. And number two, every teacher should be required at some point to have some sort of an apprenticeship in the world.
That's right.
And I realize that's a big deal. I understand what I'm saying there, and it's not as easy as it sounds. But to reconnect classroom teachers and perhaps assistant principals and principals with what we are preparing them to do, and not just read about it, theorize about it, move from the little desk in the back of the room to the big desk in the front of the room, but actually get out there and do something like that for a period of time. Then all of that translates to higher education, where I believe, wouldn't it be great if every single student who graduates from a college, a community college, a university, would also take with them a guaranteed apprenticeship when they left that stage before they went into the world of work.
Yeah.
That alone would make an enormous shift. And then make sure that professors have that same experience somewhere. If you're in the College of Business, that you're out there in some sort of an experience in the private sector, et cetera, to make sure it's not a punishment The idea is to try to give people practical application about what they're teaching and students practical application about what they're learning.
Rod, you were going to say something?
Yeah, you made a statement a few minutes ago about kids working hard. I don't want to leave the impression that kids don't want to work hard.
Yeah.
Kids are willing to work hard when they see that that's going to be the product of working hard will
That's right.
provide them the goals that they're seeking. They're not making that link between success and effort.
That's right.
That's the point.
No, you're absolutely right. So we only have a few minutes left. And the elephant in the room in all these education discussions, in spite of the bipartisanship that we've talked about and we hope for, happens to be the politics of the day. And unfortunately, ed reform has been cast in either-or terms, with some of the rancor associated with today's politics, with what's going on with the president, with what's going on around the country. I want each of you, before we close out, to talk how we can rise above politics, the politics of the day, to move forward with an agenda that addresses a sense of urgency for all kids to receive the education that they should be entitled to. Or can we do that in this environment? I want each of you to talk about that as we wrap up.
Well, it can happen, but the truth of the matter is, right now, one of the biggest reasons for partisanship is computers. Computers have become so sophisticated and that you can put in the gerrymandering of legislative, county board seats, city council, congressional seats, so a Republican seat and a Democrat seat. And so if it's a Republican seat, I don't want to talk to Rod Page because he's a Democrat. Yep. And if I do talk to him, the Koch brothers or somebody else is going to come after and get me. He's a Democrat. He's got a Democrat seat. If he doesn't toe the line, George Soros is going after him and not give him money. The problem is we have got to get back to bipartisanship. The big majority of our citizens are in the middle. But right now, it's in the partisanship of the primary elections that you elect very liberal Democrats and very conservative Republicans, and they have seen no need to communicate and come up with bipartisanship. We've got to get beyond that. It takes leadership, and it also takes a different way of reapportionment, which is an anathema to both political parties, and I'll get thrown out of the Republican Party if this is made public, so don't tell anybody.
Frank?
We all have a responsibility on this one. It's amazing to me how people can run for elected office, pick it, up to and including president, and say education is one of the most important things we do in this country, or in this state, or in this county, or in this municipality for school board, if you're running for that, right? And never have to follow it up with anything other than, and if you vote for me, I'll get more money for it. That's how we mark who the education governor's going to be, because he's committed to get $5,000 more this year than they got last year, and the other guy didn't. Nobody follows up with the hard questions is, what do you expect them to do with it? And why will the money that they spend next year be spent differently than the money they spent the year before? Because I think we've wrung all the blood out of that turnip. We just keep pumping more money into this and still say there's not enough money. Education has said since the day I was born, give us a little more money and a little more time. We'll fix all this stuff. Sure. My question's twofold. How much more money and how much time? If somebody could actually say, here, Frank, if our school district had this much money, 99% of our students would be reading on grade level, hell, I'd carry a sign for them. The reality is there will never be enough money and there will never be enough time. We got to start shaking down the people running for office and say, money is important to everybody. I stipulate to that. But just telling me you're going to get me some more doesn't tell me how you're going to help more of our children learn to read, write, and count. It doesn't tell me how you're going to stop this family school pipeline to prison deal. It doesn't tell me that why education is so important. I just am supposed to believe because you say that it is. We got to hold people's feet to the fire, and we got to shout down the groups that want to hear we need a little more money and we need a little more time, because they're the ones getting the money. And we need to start to be a louder voice for people running for office and demand answers. Everybody's not a Tommy Thompson. Everybody's not a Jeb Bush. That's a fact. Never will be. But they should at least have to tell us what they really expect of schools, as the governor said, because leadership with governors is huge in this world. And notice the places that have been at it the longest, where every governor who has replaced every previous governor remain committed to the basic principles of education reform and opportunity and change. And as soon as you get a governor who won't cross that fence because the people who helped get him there don't like that stuff, it starts getting unraveled like an old baseball. And all it takes is 4 years to put you right back where it was before. We got to stand up. Who's we? Not just us who believe in this stuff. We got to solicit the help of moms and dads whose children's education relies on this kind of thing, who've been sucked into the black hole of, I guess, they're the only show in town. I got to rely on them. I got to trust them, and can't understand who to talk to when their child can't read. It's not acceptable. We've got to stand up and shout down the well-funded, well-heeled groups and organizations who's got a stranglehold on this thing and continues to have it. And then the people who run and get money from them, therefore will tout the party line. And that's one of the reasons I'm scared to death about this midterm election. I'm scared to death about 2020. Not because of who by name or party might get elected, but we may end up with a group of people so beholding to the status quo that they're going to take us backwards, not even hold us in the status quo. I got to catch a plane.
Rod?
There's no need for me to say the same thing over again. I agree with you, Progan. So you go.
Before we can address bipartisanship, we have to address inter-party dynamics. When someone like Bob Rice, who used to work for Clinton, said that the Democratic Party of today is radically different than it was 30 years ago, that it's become a party of bundlers, elites from the West Coast and East Coast, and Wall Street type, and that his working class dad is now going to Bernie Sanders, his working class dad wouldn't find a home in the Democratic Party today. That's a Democratic Party issue. You've always had multiple themes, but within that party, we've got to look at that. On the Republican side of the fence, we've got a rising issue in identity politics in ways we haven't seen since 1956. And so I think it's going to be tough to do bipartisan until we just stop, exhale, and look in and say, how did we get here? Because I can just tell you, and I don't say this lightly, some of the dynamics I see with language, with semiotics, with politics, is not very different than what we saw in the 1850s.
Hey, Rod, you know what the rules of engagement for debate should be now?
What?
I don't want to hear one thing from either one of you about what you disagree on. We're going to spend the next hour talking about 5 things, and I want to know what you agree on regarding those 5 things, whether
gonna be
it's
a short
taxes
debate.
or education. That's right. Isn't that true?
And Frank Brogan has the last
That's
word.
the truth.
Give them a hand. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jeannie and everybody.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you, Jeannie.
25th.